to do today is look at excess burden, which is yet another use of the cost function. So excess burden, sometimes you may see that treated in maybe in a public course, maybe even a little bit in a micro book, as more of a normative question. Namely judging, how well are things working? Are people better off? Are people worse off? But the Chicago tradition is to emphasize, we're not against those questions at all, but to emphasize what do people actually do? And that's going to be my emphasis today in talking about excess burden, using it as a tool to understand what people do, how they respond in different situations. This is a list of applications of this simple tool called excess burden. Anybody know who that is? He was, I can give you a hint, he was once the chairman of our department. That is Arnold Harberger. And I'm introducing you to him because he worked a lot on the excess burden. In fact, some people don't call it the excess burden, they call it the Harberger triangle. Now, it's not always a triangle, and Harberger knew that. In fact, I'm not sure he named it after himself. Maybe his students and his friends named it. But you hear the phrase Harberger triangle, it's referring to excess burden. A couple other phrases that are used essentially for the same thing is deadweight cost and deadweight loss. So now do you know who that is? Becker. That's Becker, right? And I reintroducing you to him because he also used excess burden to formulate a theory of political economy. So he wanted to understand, well, where do policies come from? Why do we have some policies rather than others? And, being an economist, he wanted to think about, well, what does economics offer to this? He didn't just want to become a political scientist and give up his economics occupation. And he decided or discovered that excess burden has a lot to say about the policies that we have and the policies we don't have. And excess burden is clearly an economics topic. So he wrote a couple papers on this. The first one that he published turned out to be the most cited quarterly Journal of Economics paper in like a 2 or 3 decade time frame. So it was a pretty successful theory. That, anybody know who that is? He's still alive. So is Harberger. That is Art Laffer. And we'll see that excess burden is kind of the mirror image of the Laffer curve. Now the Laffer curve is named for Art Laffer. He was in our business school, and he did not invent the Laffer curve. He acknowledges that. If you read some of his writings, he talks about the history of it. One of my favorite applications of the Laffer curve, maybe my favorite economics book ever written, was by Keynes. Keynes wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and he used the Laffer curve. It wasn't called the Laffer curve back then because Laffer wasn't even born, but he used really the economics of the Laffer curve to make some important, bold predictions about how things would play out in the world in the 20th century. He wrote this book in 1919, and turned out to be, tragically, turned out to be quite accurate because his predictions were not optimistic. And these are 2 more Chicago economists. Richard Posner is also a law professor and a judge, federal judge. I believe he's retired from the judgeship now. And Tom Phillipson. And the two of them use excess burden to think about infectious disease and also a bit to think about crime. So we're going to mention some of these today. So here's